Bueno, lo conseguimos. Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. De nuevo, bienvenida a la segunda sesión de la tercera edición del seminario Remapeando los estudios asiáticos. Tenemos hoy, por tercera vez también, a un profesor que inauguró prácticamente esta serie de seminarios conmigo hace 3 años y que cada año conseguimos que vuelva con nosotras y que nos acompañe en una de las sesiones. Es el profesor Millward de la Universidad de Georgetown en los Estados Unidos. Es profesor del Departamento de Historia y su investigación se centra especialmente en la historia de Asia Central y de China, con especial interés en la región de Xinjiang. La charla que nos va a dar hoy se titula, como podéis ver en la pantalla, y a continuación, después de esta charla, vamos a intentar que la tecnología nos asista y que pueda entrar un compañero por Skype y que pueda seguir un poco con el diálogo y el debate a partir también de la charla del profesor Millward. De nuevo, muchas gracias y le cedo la palabra a Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such a beautiful afternoon. Sorry I'm a little bit late, although Kiara tells me I'm right on time for Spain. So I just walked down from the Mirador San
Miguel Alto.
San Miguel Alto, yeah, so it's beautiful. So I'm all covered with dust and I'm very thirsty. So perfect. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about ways of thinking about and talking about China, and particularly Chinese history. And I'm suggesting to you and also to some of my colleagues in America and around the world, I guess mainly colleagues who are writing about China in Western languages. In any language, I suppose. That there are some concepts that we use all the time and we're completely used to using when we talk about China, and also some words, some vocabulary that we use, which I think is actually reinforcing a vision of China and a vision of China's past that allows for the oppression of minority peoples. I'm putting quotes because I'm going to suggest that minority people is not the right word, but non-Chinese peoples in the People's Republic of China today. So with no more introduction, I'll just begin. So I think hope you can see that. Stop police brutality. There's a couple other versions of it, but we'll go back to this one. I think this is best. Yeah, it's the best one. Okay, so as the demonstrations in Hong Kong intensified in the fall of 2019, the contentious policies of Hong Kong's status also erupted in debates and clashes in Australia, Europe, the United States, as well as other places between Hong Kongers, this is people from Hong Kong, like to call themselves Hong Kongers now, between Hong Kongers and PRC citizens. Somebody on my own campus at Georgetown University wrote in chalk this sentiment on the red bricks of a square. We have a square there called Red Square. It has nothing to do with the Soviet Red Square. But what they wrote, as you can see, is stop police brutality, stop political arrests. And then someone else wrote down below, Hong Kong belongs to China. And I'll come back to this one, but you can just see it's very clear. There was also another conversation in chalk, just a left, and some people wrote back in Chinese, you've been brainwashed by American imperialism, or maybe by English imperialism, things like that. So you see there's contention there. Now, I was surprised by this because usually the students at my university at Georgetown in general, and particularly the Chinese students, are not very political at all. They just do their business, they're trying to get their jobs with the government or with banks or whatever. But I was even more surprised by the non sequitur in this response. That's the same word in Spanish, right? Yeah. That is, the response, Hong Kong belongs to China, is a non sequitur to the question. And it's the same non sequitur that we find in official white papers released by the Chinese State Council regarding Xinjiang and Tibet anytime that there's an international outcry about oppressive Chinese policies in these regions. These white papers begin their discussion always with a history lesson about the interactions between some ancient Chinese dynasty and then the peoples who are in Tibet or Xinjiang now. And the reason they bring up this history of past empires is a way of asserting that Tibet or the Uyghur region, or in this case, Hong Kong, is part of China. Right? So their first response is to go back to ancient history about this. And of course, by China, those making these assertions of possession, they mean the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party state established in 1949, which extended control over Xinjiang that year, control over Tibet in 1951 and 1959, and only over Hong Kong indirectly in 1997. That extension of control, of course, involved in different proportions and diplomacy, and force, particularly in Tibet in 1959, as well as ongoing military, police, political, and legal forms of coercion that remain key to PRC governance in these regions. And this, of course, is clear from the government response, the Hong Kong government response to the protests, demonstrations in Hong Kong sort of last summer and through the fall, and even continuing right now. So why is this historical claim that such and such a place belongs to China, why is that a non sequitur? Well, first of all, as a criticism to state policies and actions in these territories today, this reflexive PRC assertion that Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Tibet belongs to China, this assertion answers the wrong question. Because no country, even if they are in absolute possession of a place, that doesn't give a country a right to, let me back up. It's an answer to the wrong question because nobody is challenging China's sovereignty over Hong Kong. If you write stop police brutality, stop political arrests, that has nothing to do with Hong Kong independence, nothing to do with sovereignty. So you see there's a defensiveness in the response, right? So no one's challenging that. Likewise, in the People's Republic of China today, and on permitted social media, they call Hong Kong activists independence activists, sort of gangdu fenzi in Chinese. They themselves, most overwhelmingly, are not claiming that. Okay. There's a second problem with this response, and that is that sovereignty over a territory, so-called ownership of a territory, does not give a state the right to abuse its people any way they want. Right? It makes it easier if you're a state wanting to abuse people if you control that territory, but that does not give you a right. And the logic of this statement here, and the logic of the state white papers that go back to ancient history to answer complaints about human rights today, that logic is the same logic as that of a wife beater, a man who hits his wife, who, when told to stop beating his wife, says, "She's my wife, I'll beat her if I want to." Right? That's essentially the logic of this response. She belongs to me. There's a third problem in this X belongs to China excuse. And that's the subject of my talk today. To say that Xinjiang, Tibet, or even Hong Kong belongs to China because of ancient history, or because of any history earlier than the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, to say that relies on a particular kind of historical paradigm, an exceptionalist paradigm, and an empirically very factually suspect paradigm as well. And yet this paradigm, I would say, is entirely normal in any discussion of Chinese history, in any language. This paradigm treats China as a kind of metaphysical entity, unconstrained by space or time, which is seen to occupy places even at times when it wasn't there, and is to continue without any break, even when it's very clear that there were lots of interruptions between the various states of China. So it's a notion of timeless China that forever has occupied the territory that the PRC occupies today. or that the Qing Empire once occupied, projecting back in time modern space, and then assuming that there was no break along the way. So this is, quite clearly, a nationalistic fiction that any objective student of Chinese history can recognize right away. But nevertheless, this historical paradigm has been and remains completely normalized within the Chinese studies field. And today, with millions of Uyghurs in internment camps and forced to labor in factories, with Tibetan children prohibited from studying their mother tongue, with Buddhistic centers being razed to the ground, with Hong Kong police cracking heads, throwing tear gas into the subways, and arresting dissidents under the cover of coronavirus, today it's time to unnormalize this paradigm. Chiara is smiling. She's been working on me for years to make me less moderate about China, and she's succeeded now. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about these conceptual problems and vocabulary problems, and then I'm going to suggest a better approach to the Chinese states over time in East Asia. So let's start with some conceptual problems. And let's see. Okay, we've sort of moved past here. This is just an example of these white papers that I was talking about. And you can see how they begin, right, with ancient history of the Han Dynasty about Xinjiang. All right, so the first conceptual problem, I think, or one of the big ones, is something I talked about in my classes the other day. I don't see anybody there from those classes, so I'm not worried about repeating myself. This is it's really a bundle of three different ideas. The idea of Sinicization, of kind of automatic turning into Chinese, of the tributary system. Have anybody heard about this tributary system idea in your Chinese history?
El sistema tributario. Sí. Eso oído hablar, ¿verdad?
Okay. And then the notion of tianxia, or all under heaven. Right. And these three ideas kind of work together, each one reinforcing the other, to create a really particular, and what I'm calling metaphysical notion of China through time. So I could talk an awful lot, and in fact, at an earlier version of the Remapping conference, I did already critique the tianxia model quite a bit. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this all under heaven notion, the idea that Chinese thinkers and Chinese rulers through time saw their realm not as a single space known as China, but rather as this continually, as everything under heaven, as the whole world from which their power kind of radiated out in a gradient, extending out to the ends of the world. So in other words, an unbounded view of what the emperor supposedly ruled over. In this view, everyone is potentially Chinese, but just in more or less civilized along those lines. And the further away you get from the center, the more barbaric people are, supposedly. So this is the way we talk about a supposed traditional Chinese worldview. There are several problems with that, though. One is that if you actually look at documents, if you actually look at interactions between China and other states, they didn't really act as if they believed that. That's an ideal, it's a kind of propaganda, but it doesn't actually describe the approach to international relations of Chinese monarchs at most points in time. And it certainly doesn't describe the way neighboring peoples and neighboring states saw China either. You know, they had a very different idea. They didn't accept this hierarchical vision. So that's tianxia. Closely related to that is the system, the tributary system. Now, the tributary system idea consists of both actual institutions and then a set of ceremonial protocols. And in this theory about how China interacted with other places, Chinese emperors assumed themselves to be at the very top of the hierarchy, and neighbors would have to come in and kowtow and bow to the Chinese emperor and participate in this ceremony and recognize that they were inferior in order to deal with China, and in particular, in order to trade with China. And the idea of this system that came together, in particular, out of British interactions with the Qing Empire. And the Britons wanted to trade more. They were forced to go through some of this diplomacy. They saw it as demeaning and didn't want to bow down on the knee. And the argument goes, this old traditional mode of international relations that China followed was not up to date. It couldn't work in the modern world. And ultimately, there was a clash of civilizations. The Opium War ended this old idea of the tributary system. And as you can see, it's very clearly a kind of apology for British imperialism. But another problem is, again, as with the idea of the Tian Xia concept, this is a outsider's description. I'm sorry, this is a description of an ideal. It's a description of a concept in some Chinese writings, but it doesn't actually empirically describe the way China worked. There was lots of trade along the borders. There were all sorts of variations. It wasn't in any means the case that during every dynasty, every people had to follow this same kind of system. So, as I like to say, we're talking about this. There's two problems with the idea of tribute system. One is tribute, the other is system, because it's neither systematic nor was it really about paying tribute. Anyway, I won't talk more about that, but we can if you have questions later on. One of the things that comes out of this, though, and political scientists today very often talk about this, and when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, very often you'll hear people saying, this is a return to the traditional mode of international relations in East Asia, with China being at the center and through a hierarchical system, controlling a peaceful version or a peaceful zone of international relations in Asia. Right? And that's always contrasted with Europe, which in the early modern and modern period was fighting all the time. Whereas, according to this theory, because of this beneficent, this happy hierarchy under China's rule, East Asia was peaceful. Right? So political scientists will argue that. China argues it implicitly. It's implicit in the Belt and Road ideology. Again, the only problem with it is it's wrong. Asia, East Asia, in early modern and modern periods, wasn't particularly peaceful. In fact, the only way you can argue that it was peaceful is by ignoring wars or explaining them away as not really wars because they didn't involve state actors. They involved nomadic peoples, maybe not Korea, fighting with China. Or, and this is my favorite one, and China makes this argument all the time, China had no wars with any of its neighbors. The only wars that China had were civil wars between Chinese people themselves, right? That's because they define all the neighbors as Chinese, and therefore all the wars go away. They become civil wars, internal wars. So that's the problem with this China system idea. And then related to that is this notion of Sinicization, that peoples automatically, spontaneously, organically came over and became Chinese, rather than ever being conquered, right, or brought in by military force. And this, of course, is related to why all the wars were civil wars, right? You simply argue that everyone is Chinese. Likewise, they argue that, and by they I mean Chinese propagandists, but also many Western scholars, right up to today, that the so-called conquest dynasties or alien dynasties, so peoples from Inner Asia, so Mongols, Manchus, Tablach, other sorts of peoples, Kitai, Jurchen, who conquered China and established dynasties, that they simply became Chinese through this magical process, and therefore we don't consider them foreign anymore. Right? Now, you could really just as well, again, there's ample evidence that they maintained cultural difference. You can see that this is a kind of propagandistic sleight of hand to explain away foreign conquest. There certainly were cultural differences. And one could just as well say, really, if you look closely, as scholars have done now at the Qing Empire in particular, if you look closely, you see that those differences were maintained and they were very important. And you really should just as well say that China was barbarianized, as you should say that the barbarians were Sinicized. Right? It works both ways. Buddhism, for example, is a foreign religion that came in and became deeply entrenched in China during a period when non-Chinese rulers were in charge. So that's a huge example. Right? Okay, so without going into further detail, that complex of ideas, tiansha, tribute system, synesthization, work together, and you can see the kinds of tricks that it is allowed in order to understand China. Okay. The next problem, conceptual problem that I want to talk about, is really the idea of China itself. My fingers are getting tired already because I'm wiggling them around so much in the air, making scare quotes, air quotes. But I'm going to try to suggest that we need to remember those quotes when we say the word China the way we normally do. And then another word that's closely connected to this understanding of China's history is dynasties. Right? Other places have kingdoms, they have monarchies that come and go, empires sometimes. China has dynasties. And to demonstrate this, Kiara, I don't know, can you just click on that screen? I don't know if this will work within, but I've got a, yes. And do we have sound?
Yes, we should.
And so blow it up. So, let's pause it for 1 second, I'm sorry. So this is a YouTube video made by two Harvard professors. I'm going to be picking on Harvard a lot today, not because they're exceptional, but because they kind of, there's a Chinese expression, which I can't quite remember, but chu tou niao. Anyway, the bird that sticks out its head, the one that gets its head cut off. So the Harvard professors are those birds that stick out their heads right now. Anyway, so they made this, as you can see, how to memorize the names of the dynasties. Kiara, you could play DJ, start it up.
You know, we have a song that we teach in class to help people remember the names of the Meiji dynasty.
Right. It really does help to know which dynasty comes before.
Yeah. So we're less concerned with the dates than
Right.
we are with the chronological order, the sequence of
Right.
dynasties. Can you sing that song?
I cannot sing it as well as you can.
Well, shall we sing it together? Only if we sing it together.
Okay.
上州秦汉，上州秦汉，隋唐宋，隋唐宋，元明清 Republic， 元明清 Republic， 毛泽东，毛泽东。
All right, we can stop it right there.
No, please, one more time.
One more time. You can sing it all together if you want to. So it is helpful. If you do need to learn the dynasties, it does help. You really okay? Good. Let's do it again.
No.
No. Okay. All right. By the way, this tune is there a Spanish song to that same tune?
No, we were house.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a French one. Which is that's right.
In Italian we have one.
Yeah. Not in Spanish.
¿En España no hay una canción con esta musiquilla?
In Chinese, it's san shi lao hu, 3 tigers, pao de kuai, running fast. Anyway, well, so this is it, right? This is the list of dynasties, and this is how Chinese history is organized, right? It's made up of a linear succession of dynasties. One ends, and then the next day, the next one begins. And this is deeply ingrained into how we talk about the Chinese past. These Harvard professors, I'm sure they teach this to their students on the first day, so for on all the exams they know how to do this. It provides a convenient periodization. Now, of course, we're also we're skipping over many inconvenient periods. Again, I don't know how much how well you know this, but the northern and southern dynasties, which followed the Han, were a very complex period with lots of different dynasties at the same time. Some in the north, some in the south. Many of them were non-Chinese. Likewise, the 5 dynasties, whose individual names very few people can remember. And then there's also 2 very important dynasties that are left off of this list, but that in fact were written in to the official histories. So if you count all, each dynasty writes the history of the dynasty before, right? And in fact, these dynasties had histories written. They're left out of here. All right, so for a prize, anyone know which major important dynasties are left out? We have the Zhou. Oh, not the main Zhou.
I have no idea, but
I'll give you a hint. No, good. I'll give you a hint. Near the it's near the Yuan period.
we didn't reach that.
You haven't gotten that yet. Okay. Have you heard of the Jin dynasty and the Liao dynasty? The Jurchen Jin and the Qitai Liao. So the Song you've heard of, right? Some people think modernity in Asia begins in the Song period. All sorts of things. Neo-Confucian thought began then, and so on. The Song got driven south of the Yangtze River, and that's what we call the Southern Song at that point. And then who's in North China then? There's a couple other dynasties. First, one called the Liao, who are Khitan people. They're nomadic people from Mongolia. But Khitan is actually where we get the word Khitai. If you know the Russian word for China, it's Khitai, right? So it was quite important then. And then along with them was the Jin dynasty, who were Jurchens, and they're the ancestors of the Manchus later on. Okay, we could talk more about that, but they're left out. They're non-Chinese dynasties. You know, they don't seem to count because Song goes straight to Yuan, right? Now the Yuan is the Mongols, right? Kublai Khan, he established a state, and of course during that period, China was part of this broader broader Mongol empire, right? The China bit was called Yuan, but there's a bigger picture. Now, what the Chinese officials wanted to do was to go straight from Song to Yuan. When they wrote the history of their predecessor, of their previous dynasty, the Chinese officials in Yuan time said, we'll just write the Song. The Mongols said, oh no, you can't skip over these nomad peoples, the Jin and the Liao. We like them, they're our friends. Many of them are actually incorporated in the Mongol Empire. And just because they're not Chinese, racially or ethnically, doesn't mean you can skip them, right? You can leave them out. And so the Yuan dynasty insisted that Jin and Liao be written in at the Song, along with the Song. Now, the reason that's important is because this is the first time when you have three major states in China, three major dynasties existing at the same time. And suddenly the Song doesn't work anymore. Suddenly the linear list has to kind of have branches, and you have to accept the idea that there are multiple Chinas, right? And multiple Chinas of different races or of different ethnicities, okay? So in fact, there were periods like that, many, many periods like that. But this was a major one. And so I think it's very significant. It's not just the Harvard professor's problem, but it happens very often in textbooks and introductions that we've left these out. But this shows how this dynastic approach to China, one of the things it does is it displaces and it erases other peoples, less significant peoples, states that for some reason didn't make it into the official accounting of Chinese official histories. And yet they were there. In many cases they were very powerful. Okay? So we see a nationalistic logic even in this system like this. And in fact, non-Chinese dynasties actually ruled in China, some of them are counted here, for over 1,000 years out of the last 2,000. So just about half of the time since the first emperor of China, the Qin emperor, unified this state. About half of that time, non-Chinese dynasties were ruling. Okay, so this makes us ask: wait a minute, who exactly is Chinese? Why exactly are these all considered to be China when half of them were not ruled by Chinese? And the only way you can reconcile that contradiction, of course, is with the Sinicization idea, this idea of automatic ethnic conversion. Okay, so some of this kind of criticism was begun and became very prominent in the last 15, 20 years or so in writing about the Qing Empire, the Qing dynasty, the last empire. And many people were talking about this. Many people questioned whether it was appropriate to say that the Qing just turned Chinese, because it was so clear that the Manchus did not, right? They were very aware of their own identity. But what the field as a whole of Chinese studies, the field as a whole has not yet done, is followed this criticism through to its conclusion and challenged this entire approach to history that uses this dynastic lineage as the organizing principle. And I think it's time to challenge that lineage. The dynasty model is not just a convenient periodization, but a forceful ideological assertion and even a tool for displacement and ethnocide. It is as much a metaphysical notion as tianxia or Sinicization, and is closely linked to them. It erases non-Chinese identities, and at the same time, by saying everyone is Chinese, it also makes the concept of Chinese itself essentially meaningless. Because if everybody's Chinese, then what does Chinese mean? Now, when we talk about other parts of the world, other places of a comparable scale, we discuss multiple polities over time. We note different ruling houses, different territories, different names for the respective polities and kingdoms. In Chinese history, however, with the dynastic cycle model, for some reason, all of those different polities, all of those different states, are all considered to be China, one after another. They go through cycles of unity and disunity, with unity always assumed to be the desirable norm, based on an assumption that back in the Zhou dynasty there was such a unified state. That's a questionable assumption to begin with. Now there are reasons why we do follow this dynastic model, why basically even below the level of the dynasty, Chinese history is marked emperor by emperor. So you can't have two emperors ruling at the same time in different places. You have to decide which one is the right one, is the proper one. And this goes back to the writing by a man who's known as the father of Chinese history, Sima Qian, whom you may have heard of. And I won't go into too much detail about him, but basically he created the template that he was writing a universal history, but within it he created a template of following emperor by emperor in one part of his book called the Basic Annals. And then all the other peoples and other states who he was considering peripheral to the story, he put in other sections of the book. He gave them special essays, special treatises, but he kind of determined what the central line of history from the Qin dynasty through the Han would be. And that whole template, that whole structure of writing history stuck and became the model that was used in the official histories from then on. So that's one of the reasons for this. It's very interesting because it's a nationalistic approach to history. We don't think about nationalism having been invented in the 1st century BC. But in China, there's definitely nationalism to the history writing already at that point. And so it's impressive as a feat of history writing. But that doesn't make it any less propaganda, and particularly since it's been perpetuated through the centuries. So what I suggest is that rather than talk about this whole 2,500 years of history as China, which of course allows you to say, if you're the People's Republic of China today, it allows you to say, well, China was in Xinjiang 2,000 years ago during the Han. Forget about China. Let's not talk about China. Let's use the names of these dynasties themselves. Let's call them what they called themselves, which is these names. So we should talk about Han and Qin and Sui and Tang and Liao and Jin and so forth. And instead use China as a geographical term, as a cultural term. And if we do that, and let me just say, there is great cultural and institutional continuity from at least the first millennium BC, right up to the present. I'm not denying that at all. The classical texts, the Chinese language itself, Confucian traditions, family system. There are many, many things we can point to that do reach back in time, right? That do show continuity. And so you might ask, well, if there's all this continuity, doesn't this make Chinese history different from that of other places? Isn't that why we can talk about the People's Republic of China somehow being the same as the Han Dynasty, right? Well, I don't deny these great continuities, but I argue that these continuities are really not that different from continuities that you find in Europe, in European history, or continuities in Southwest Asia, so the Persian world and the Islamic world, over a similarly long span of time. In fact, the role played by the Greco-Roman Christian tradition in Europe, or by the Persian Islamic tradition in Southwest, South, and Central Asia, is actually strikingly similar to that of the Chinese tradition in East Asia. What differs is simply how we talk about that continuity. In the history of Christendom and of the Islamic, each are characterized by many distinct and often warring polities. Although they share religio-political institutions and culture based on ancient languages, so Greek and Latin, Persian and Arabic, the languages in particular in which sacred texts are written, right? And it's the same in China. There's a sacred language in which their oldest traditional texts are written, that of classical Chinese. Some of the larger imperial polities in Christendom and in the Islamicate themselves even claimed to be universal inheritors of historical cultural legitimacy, just like Chinese dynasties always claim. If you think about the Ottoman revival of the Caliphate, right, or the Holy Roman Empire, both of them, in terms very similar to that of the Chinese lineage of orthodoxy, were claiming to be the successors, the inheritors of this tradition, the single carriers on of that broader European or broader Islamic tradition. But we don't organize those historians, the past of Europe or the past of the Islamicate as a linear set of polities, of which this set of kingdoms counts, all the other kingdoms don't count, right? It's only in China where we have that inclusive and exclusive approach to organizing history. And this dynastic model that we use in China, it creates some real absurdities. One is the way in which we treat non-Chinese dynasties and also they're both non-Chinese and they're also Chinese at the same time. I call this the having your cake and eating it too approach to the dynasties. So take, for example, so we talked about that before and all the contradictions there, right? Here's another absurdity. Take, for example, this sentence from a new textbook published in 2018 by Harvard University Press. This is strike number 2 against Harvard today. So here's the textbook. I should have put it in my slide. I'm sorry I didn't. But so quote, very early in its history, China became a unified empire in 221 BC. Okay, so there he's referring to the Qin dynasty, the first emperor. He's the guy with the terracotta warriors, right? Okay. Very early in its history, China became a unified empire. However, unity proved to be fragile and elusive for many centuries. Okay, that's the same sentence. Is China a unified empire, or is China disunified, right? What he's saying, because he has this concept of China as a unified empire, even when for centuries it's not, looking back, ideally it's supposed to be somehow. Well, who decided it's supposed to be? It's a modern nationalistic projection back. So, even while explaining that there was no such thing as a unified China for many centuries, and admitting that half of the rulers in China were non-Chinese, the textbook nonetheless tells us that China existed even during the centuries when, he also tells us, it didn't. So I'm picking on this one textbook, but that argument is very, very common, and you find it all the time, right? So I propose that we be much more aware of the implications of organizing the history of mainland East Asia around this idea of dynasties and around this timeless notion of China. In addition to using the actual names of past states on the East Asian mainland, instead of this kind of fuzzy term, China. And I think we should use China kind of the way we talk about Europe, right, or the Islamic world. It's a similar kind of concept. But I also suggest we introduce a new term. I think it's kind of new. I may not have made it up exactly myself, but relatively new. the syndicate. So by analogy to the word Islamicate, which people use for the Islamic word, or Christendom more or less, right? That we use this term, the syndicate, as a historical concept indicating cultural continuity, shared historical memory, modes of legitimation, many institutions, and all that kind of thing, but not implying political unity or political continuity in this timeless, metaphysical, essentialist way we always use the word China. Yes?
How do you
It's a good question. So, S-I-N-I, as in C, cynic, A-T-E. Anyway, it sounds a bit like syndicate, but syndicate. And again, Islamicate is a term that was invented by world historians to talk about the Islamic world really the same way. Right, so I think this concept, first of all, it avoids exceptionalism in how we talk about the eastern part of the Afro-Eurasian continent, because it allows us to talk about it in ways very similar to how we talk about the Islamic world in Europe. But it's not really a European concept that's being transferred to China and applied. So for example, it's often a criticism that we take the idea of nationalism from modern European experience, or even modernity, and we define it based on modern European experience, and then we go over to China and we look and we say, oh, well, China doesn't quite look the same as Europe. Therefore China must be lacking in some degree or something like that. That's a common Eurocentric practice, right? But I don't think this idea of syndicate is Eurocentric. It's a global historical approach. Okay, so those are just two of the kind of broad concepts: the dynasties and then the Qianxia tributary system syndicization group, which I think really distort our approach to China. And now I want to talk a little bit about some problems with terminology, okay? Just with specific words that we tend to use a lot. And when I say we, I'm definitely including myself. I've committed all of these sins many times, sometimes not knowing they're sins. I don't know, I'm not a good Catholic, I don't know if not knowing it's a sin means it counts or not, but in any case, now I do. I've taken confession with Professor Olivieri, and she's taught me about my sins of vocabulary. Anyway, I'm sorry. Okay, so I want to start with, and here I think I do have some slides. Oh, let's see, did I miss this? Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, this is really important. So anyway, back when we were talking about the tributary system, I realize this slide is not very clear. But, so I'll just tell you. Oh, whoa. There we go. Oh, this is not showing up. So right here, yeah, it's not clear anyway. But I want to show you, this is a map, again, from that same textbook that I'm being so mean about. This is about the Qing Empire and the territorial losses. So as Western imperialism and Japanese and Russians started carving off pieces of China, this is a map meant to show this. But what's interesting is Burma, what's now Vietnam, Laos, big chunk of what's now Kazakhstan, Nepal, Burma, I said Burma. Anyway, all of these places around here that are put in these, like this, with a label in them. This calls them Chinese vassals. That's a Spanish term, right? So the feudal term of a vassal. That's how the map maker translated this notion of being a tributary, right? And of course, it's not right at all. I mean, a vassal has a much closer and is much more closely controlled by a feudal lord, has to pay taxes, has to provide military service, and so on. And yet, tributaries get thought about this way. All right, I'll come back to this point in a minute. Okay, so here's just some of the terminology. Starting with this word, inherit. Very often said that the People's Republic of China inherited the territories of the Qing Empire, right? That's a phrase I've said, written many, many times. And of course, what we mean is that this big map with the bold line around it, that's the line of the People's Republic of China today. This one here, right? So minus Outer Mongolia, but the big picture is of the Qing Empire, pretty much, right? So the PRC is pretty much the same size as the Qing Empire before it. So when we say it inherited the territory, that's what we mean. But PAC did not just naturally inherit them, the way you would inherit something from a rich uncle who died, right? Or if your parents pass away, God forbid, you inherit the house. That's not how it worked. The People's Republic of China reacquired these territories, in some cases through diplomatic means, in many cases through military means, in many cases through just the contingencies of 20th century post-World War II situation. But it was not automatic. Now, when I say this, I'm not challenging the People's Republic of China's sovereignty in Tibet or in Xinjiang, or not necessarily. There may be reasons that some people want to challenge that, right? But as a historian, to say that this was not a matter of simple inheritance, that does not challenge the People's Republic of China's sovereignty. Sovereignty is based on other factors, on international law, perhaps upon legitimate rule, right? But China sees sovereignty as really based on this particular version, this historical claim. Tibet belongs to China. Hong Kong belongs to China. And that's a different sort of thing. So I'd say inherit, we should be careful with that. And even more so, there are a bunch of words that are used very often. Unify, reunify. So the verb that's used when talking about Taiwan from mainland China, the Chinese Communist Party wants to unify Taiwan, right? Tongyi, to make it part of Taiwan. Now, sometimes we translate this word tongyi in Chinese as unify. Sometimes we go even further in English than the Chinese word itself and say reunify, right? How many of you know Chinese? Any of you? Or Japanese? A few? Okay. Anyway, I'll just tell you. So this word, the Chinese word that I put up there, tongyi, there's no re in it. There's no again in that word. The again comes from your concept that China is this metaphysical entity that is unified even when it isn't, right? It's that exact same logical problem that I talked about before. Similarly, pacify, it's often written, again, in English and other languages, that the empire pacified territories in Central Asia. But what the empire really did was conquer territories in Central Asia, and then argue that the people resisting it were bandits who needed to be pacified. Right? So this is all the propagandistic language of the winner, of the conqueror. You never want to legitimate the people you've just conquered, so you call them bandits or something like that. All right. Tributaries, I just talked about, on the map. The problem with using that kind of term, it doesn't mean vassals. Right? And again, the problem with the tribute system is that it confuses a worldview, a Sinocentric worldview, with a real world order. Right? We see the worldview in propagandistic ritual texts, but that doesn't mean that's the way Asia really was. It doesn't mean that's the way people interacted in the past. It's very one-sided to take that point, right? It's taking the point of view of the Chinese center to say that, and not thinking about Korea or Vietnam or Nepal or all the peoples in the frontiers. Notion of frontiers, borderlands, and peripheries. Just looking at this map again. Sorry, I'm going
No,
to
no,
step out of the screen for a minute.
it's okay.
Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, Taiwan, all of these territories were conquered by the last dynasty, by the Qing Empire, the Manchu Empire, and added into their broader empire along with China. And of course, they came from what we call Manchuria, or northeastern China in the first place. So this whole realm of territories like this were imperial conquests added in. We talk about them, though, and you find them in textbooks as borderlands, the Chinese borderlands, the Chinese peripheries. And you'll even see people say, the Qing dynasty reunified the borderlands, right? So we just talked about the problem with unifying someplace that was never part of you in the first place. But then to refer to your these recent conquests as frontiers or as borders, this is something that happens very often, or used to happen in the historiography of the United States and the Americas. All of these places out in the West, so Arizona, New Mexico, California, all these places with Spanish names, strangely enough, right? We refer to those as the frontier, and sort of the Northern Europeans moving across the West into the open lands, into the open frontier, farming the desert. It's always an assumption that there's nobody there, right? But of course there were people there. And the same thing with the frontiers of Inner Asia, of Central Asia, and Mongolia and so on. There were lots of people there with their own ways of living. There's a historical process that's also an environmental process, whereby steppe land and prairie was converted to farm, or deep jungles of Southeast Asia were converted to rice paddies, things like this. And with that environmental change, of course, is an ethnic change as Han peoples moved in. And this happened over the last couple hundred years of history. It's not unique to China at all. I mentioned the Americas. You see it in Latin America. The Russian expansion across Siberia had many similar problems. It's a aspect of world history, and it's a way in which we can show that China is part of world history, not an exception to it. So when we talk about borderlands, we have to remember that they're not open. When we talk about frontiers, we have to remember that they've been made frontiers by a process of conquest as people are moving in and beginning to settle them. So another word which we might use for these frontiers, or the peripheries, or the borderlands, is colony. And it's a word we here I mean me, not Chiara, but is very seldom used when talking about, for example, Xinjiang, right? A colony of the Qing Empire, or a colony of the People's Republic of China. And yet it very clearly is. There are active measures to move people out there, Han people to settle it, active measures to irrigate and open land, active measures to extract minerals. It's really, Xinjiang in particular, the far northwest of China, is a textbook example of a colony. And they even more or less called it that themselves until the 20th century under the People's Republic of China, a communist state, which of course is opposed to colonialism in theory, and so therefore cannot use that vocabulary. But it's very clear. So American, mea culpa, the Western historians of China have very much covered up this process by refusing to use that term, colony. So those are some terms about sort of places and spaces. Terms about people. So very often in traditional, in the way we talk about China, of course, we talk about the Chinese versus the barbarians. Right? That doesn't happen so much anymore, or if we use the word barbarian, we put it in quotes. That's something we've caught and are better at. But nowadays, when talking about any people in China, certainly today in the People's Republic of China, but also way in the past, at any point in China's history, the official People's Republic of China version of history says that any peoples who were ever in any part of the territory that is now China, those peoples, as I said before, by definition, those peoples are Chinese, right? So all the wars are civil wars, right? There is no conquest. And so since they are not Han Chinese, but other tribes or other peoples or other groups, right? They automatically become 少数民族. They become minority ethnic groups or minority peoples, minority nationalities. Even when talking about the 5th century BC or at any point in time. You know, the Mongol Empire, the Mongols came in and made China part of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were a 少数民族, were a minority nationality ruling in China. Okay? That's the definitional system that is used in Chinese official history today. And it is, again, a term that is ubiquitously used by Western historians of China as well. We use it all the time. To the point where Tibetans living in Tibet are described as a minority nationality. Or the Uyghurs living in the Uyghur Autonomous Region are described as minorities in their own homeland, right? Because they've been incorporated in this broader thing called China. So I think we need to be aware of the colonialistic and imperialistic implications of calling people minorities. And Benedict Anderson, in writing about nationalism and the census, had pointed out that you only get a minority when you have a nation-state model that is looking for a majority. You know, who is the majority people of this territory? You label them, and then you send your census takers out and ask people who they are, and if they're not that person, they instantly become a minority, even if they've lived in that village or state for centuries. Right? So minorities are made like that. They're not simply a mathematical result. Even the concept of Han itself. You've probably heard this term, the Han Chinese, the Chinese, these are the native speakers of Mandarin, the vast majority people of China. And of course, there are 55 other groups officially recognized in China today, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, Zhuang, Hui, Miao, various all sorts of people like this. But the Han are the vast majority, 90-some%. And we're told that China is largely a homogeneous kind of place, nationally homogeneous kind of place, because the Han are such a great majority. That's fine, and actually I think most people in China, most Han even, recognize that. There aren't too many people who are who dispute being called a Han. But the term Han includes vast diversity. Just looking linguistically, there are hundreds of dialects, but there are really 8 major language families that are all, we call them all Chinese dialects, but in fact they're much more different than Spanish, Italian, Portuguese. They're more like English and Spanish, or German and English, or something like that. Sometimes even further. And yet all of those are called Chinese. So there's huge linguistic diversity. There are groups that, such as the Hakka, who for hundreds of years have been a traveling group that has been displaced from their own home and lived in other places and been subject to discrimination and other kinds of things. They have their own dialect and so on. But they are not considered a minority group, although they look like, I don't know, Jews in Europe or Chinese in other parts of Southeast Asia or something in terms of how they fit. They're completely ethnic and yet they're not included. So this word Han itself includes great diversity. Finally, this idea of overseas Chinese. The People's Republic of China likes to think of all Chinese all over the place as still kind of Chinese. The clearest example of this right now is of a Hong Kong publisher who is a Swedish citizen, but he was kidnapped from Thailand by Chinese authorities and brought back and has been punished in China and locked up because they considered him Chinese and they didn't like what he was doing in Hong Kong. And there's several examples of this kind of thing you can point to right now. But there's a scholar named Shi Shumei who has said that diaspora has an expiration date. In other words, you can't be a diasporic person tied to the homeland of your ancestors. That doesn't go on forever. Eventually you become native somewhere else. And so Chinese like to think of all Chinese groups as still Chinese, but I think it's helpful, and they use this term overseas Chinese, right? Even if generations have passed. Now, instead of thinking about Chinese background people, let's think about English speakers from Canada, United States, Australia, other places, Bermuda, things like this, right? We are not all overseas English, right? Sometimes some of them are in the British Commonwealth, whatever that means, right? But there is an Anglophone world, and there is a cultural connection, but it is not tied to a political homeland the same way. And so we should think about Chinese increasingly now as Chinese communities grow and become longer and longer lasting in other parts of the world. In Southeast Asia now, in Indonesia, and so on, there have been Chinese communities for hundreds of years, right? They're not still tied to the people of color. Anyway, so think about this sort of term. Okay, I've been going about an hour now, right? Seems so. I should try to wrap up. Let's see. I don't want to read too much more at you, but anyway. So you see, I pointed out problems of concepts. I pointed out problems of vocabulary. We could find other problems. You can turn that down. Other vocabulary problems if you wanted to. Let me just conclude then with some suggestions of a more accurate historical approach to China's history, to modern Chinese history. I think the first thing is we should stop treating China as a politically continuous entity that's thousands of years old. And rather remember that the People's Republic of China just had its 70th birthday a few months ago. That makes it 173 years younger than the United States, as I like to point out to my Chinese friends sometimes. While there is a continuity, as I said before, in this notion of China, we're dealing with a new state, and a Leninist single-party state. There's nothing about that political form that is traditionally Chinese. There's nothing that says China has to be of that form. And indeed, in Taiwan, we see other examples and so on. Of course, don't ignore the cultural continuity of China. Second, I think a new paradigm for modern Chinese history would recognize that the PRC came to power by acquiring, not by inheriting, these territories and the very ethnically diverse Qing Empire. We thus should not use the word Qing in China simultaneously. And in a way, if we think about the breakup of the Qing Empire, we could think about it in similar terms, analogous terms to those by which we think about the Ottoman Empire, breaking up in 1922, the Habsburg Empire in 1918, I guess, the Tsarist Empire in 1917, Qing broke up in 1912, right? All of them actually within just a few years of each other. It's really quite fascinating, right? All of these great early modern empires all fell apart at the same time. We tend to leave the Qing in China completely out of that story, and yet the same kind of centrifugal forces, this kind of shrapnel of different nationalities, which comes out of the fall of empires in the Middle East and in Europe and so on. It's a very similar process in China. When the Qing fell, people didn't stand around waiting for a new China to be the next successor in the dynastic chain. What happened is Mongolia declared independence. Tibet declared independence. China itself broke into multiple contenders, right? The contenders that win, we consider orthodox. Those that didn't win, we consider warlords or separatists, right? Or you know, people who were traders and worked with Japan, or traders who worked with Russia. Of course, Russia was helping the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party as well. The Americans were helping the Nationalist Party, right? So foreign help in and of itself is only delegitimizing if you happen to lose in the end, right? So the same kind of situation with multiple players came out of the Qing that we see in, the Ottoman Empire. What's different is the ultimate result. And we should give credit to the Chinese Communist Party for being organized enough, arguably being ruthless enough, maybe being clever enough in its policies in order to prevail in these decades-long struggle and reacquire these territories. But it wasn't an automatic, natural thing. Third, I want to say get rid of the tributary notion. We talked quite a lot about that. Let's see. Fourth, a new paradigm. Okay, which is what I was just talking. Would view the aftermath of the Qing in the ways I was just saying. I'm sorry, I confused my final terms here. Anyway, so final approach, or an approach like this that avoids some of this vocabulary that at least questions and maybe overturns some of our old normative ways of talking about it, these old concepts. A new paradigm like that would highlight, in fact, the plural nature of the Qing Empire, how diverse it was in ethnic terms, and also how diverse it was in terms of policies. The Qing Empire was able to rule over this vast territory with so many different peoples because it didn't have a one-size-fits-all single approach. It didn't try to sinicize people. It allowed different religions to function. It allowed different peoples to be ruled by their own rulers, their own people. The reason it did that was not because it did it to of governance over a vast and diverse place than to try and cram everyone into one model. And despite this tradition of imperial pluralism that was quite successful in the Qing, what's happening right now under the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping in particular is that he's trying to create a unitary, homogeneous idea of Chineseness. And that's why he's cracking down in Hong Kong, cracking down against the Uyghurs appallingly. He's trying to sinicize religions. And what he's really chasing after is a 19th century ideal of a homogeneous nation, which never really existed, even where we say it existed, even in Europe or anywhere else. Certainly not in China. So this kind of a new paradigm, I'm really stepping on many landmines for talking about this by saying, China is not going to make me very many friends in the People's Republic of China today, or telling them that they're a young country, right? So it may seem too political to talk about it this way, and we can go back like these Harvard professors to simply singing the dynasties, right? But it's just as political to ignore the diversity of China, the cultural diversity in particular. And for generations, by parroting euphemistic terminology and these historiographic conventions and tricks and cartographic legerdemain, tricks with map making and things like that, by doing this for generations, we've obscured the colonial past and we're tacitly accepting People's Republic of China's assimilationism and expansionist claims. So rather than talking about the PRC inheritance of this territory as a fait accompli, we should rather recognize that China is something that has been and is still being constructed through ideology and also through military, political, and diplomatic means. And that construction of this sort in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party state has entailed, and right now is continuing to entail, cultural and physical violence to millions of people, non-Chinese as well as Chinese people. And I'll stop there.
Thank you.
And happily take any questions.
Sí,
if we have.
I think we're gonna like
Okay.
make Ahmed Skype in,
Okay.
and then we start the Q&A session together.
Stay here, or should I move?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
you can stay there. Let me try whether
Stay here.
we can actually. Hello. Let me check whether it sounds. Try and talk, please.
Can you?
Can you talk? Can you say anything? No?
Sorry.
Please try and talk.
Hello.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So I'm watching myself now.
Yeah, you should.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay, I'm here.
So he's seeing your face.
Yeah, you're seeing your face, but it's okay. I mean, we can see you in the screen.
Okay.
Can
Okay.
you turn in to see the audience?
No,
Oh.
not really. It's complicated.
So, hello everybody. Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to meet you here. Although I cannot make physically be there, some bureaucracy things in Germany, and I'm very happy to be accepted in this spring school. Here, I would like to share with you some of my idea about. Also, thank you for the speech by Professor Millward. I think he has a very good understanding of Chinese history. Exactly correct. And should I share my screen now?
Yeah.
Okay, let me see how to.
Está intentando compartir su pantalla para que la PowerPoint aparezca ahí, ¿vale? Esto es súper tecnológico lo que estamos haciendo. Yeah, perfect.
Now it's there?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd like to talk about something of the Uyghur nationalism. Since I only have 15 minutes, I cannot go too much deep there, so I would like to just point some key points. First, I would like to explain the Uyghur. Nowadays, we are calling them Uyghur. This name was given by Russian and Chinese in 20 centuries. It was not, well, some of these people, their ancestors was Old Uyghur, but quite a number of them were not. But they've been given this name, so I would use the term for as New Uyghur to be distinguished with Old Uyghur. Since they've been given this name and the rising of nationalism in this region, those Uyghur intelligence and Chinese intelligence try to build up a new narrative of Uyghur history to unite these people. So now I show the these countries or regions. They in fact they influence the term and identity of New Uyghur. I will come back later. So this is the official narrative of Uyghur history, how Uyghur are from. And this is accepted by both Chinese and Uyghur. Well, there are some differences, but basically they think that the new Uyghurs are the direct descendant of old Uyghur. And the difference is Chinese announced that Uyghurs arrived in Xinjiang, or whatever you call it, East Turkestan, whatever, only after 840. But Uyghurs think they were there since very long time, and even those European language spoken groups in Tarim Basin, they also think they are Uyghurs. However, as we see, this is hello.
Yeah, we're here.
Yeah, this is old Uyghur, and there's an important group called the Karahanid Turks and Kochu Uyghur. Their territory are in nowadays Xinjiang. But in history, those people, they have different identity. I don't know how many of you can read Chinese.
A few.
Okay, and not Arabic scripts or.
Well, a few.
Anyway, okay. So this is a Chinese glossary. They recorded this people in Tarim Basin. They call themselves Musliman, and in Chinese is Huihui. However, those people in Turfan and Hubun area, they call themselves Uyghur. And meanwhile, the Chinese call them Gaochang. That's this is also recorded in Chinese history. They say in the city of Lukchun, the residents, they are two kinds. One is Huihui, one is Musliman, another is Uyghur. And they're saying those people, in East Balak, they dress like Musliman, their language like Uyghur. So actually, in the history, this group of people, they are not linguistically, historical, and ethnically, they are not the same group from their own identity and from outside, from outcomers. It all had been recorded like this, and this is a book published in Istanbul in the beginning of last century. This author is from Woja, an important city in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region on the north, and he called themselves as Turk, not Uyghur, not Chinese, or not Muslim. They call these people Turk. So actually, this structure of how the new Uyghur comes would make more sense. Those old Uyghurs descendants who moved to culture, they assimilated by those Turks in Tarim Basin, and some of them they just moved to China to east. So this is the map. So this area that used to belong, well, not very detailed. This area will belong to Karahanid, and this area used to belong to Old Uyghur. And you can still see the difference nowadays, linguistically and from the looks. But nowadays, since China extended their border into Central Asia here, so this group are cut. Their connection with West has been cut. So them living in this area together like 300 years, and then they're being given a name as Uyghur. So in this case, they need to build. They become one nation, and they need to build one nation. So they try to build up their own history. This is also done by Chinese and Uyghur. Actually, as the first page I showed in my PPT, you can see the dress, the looks, the culture are quite different. The big difference is Islam. The western part, they convert to Islam very early, and they join the cultural switching of the whole Turkic world. And this area, this region was actually belongs to the Persianate world. This line is like also like a border. On the west of this line, it belongs to Persianate world, and on the east, it belongs to the Sinic world. And when the old Uyghur moved from this area, moved out to east, and the remains, they've been assimilated by those Turks in the west. The point for them to be one is Islam. So Islam is the core of the culture of this nation, and China want to use the narrative to change this nation and manipulate this nation. So they tried a lot to compromise the culture and history of the distinct Old Uyghur. They used this name. They picked up this name, and second, they published a lot of academic work in studying of Old Uyghur and try to connect the modern Uyghur and Old Uyghur. Although it's very difficult, this is a white paper they published in 1966. And during this process, Uyghur intelligence also followed that. They try to get connected with the Old Uyghur because Old Uyghur was supposed to be very civilized and produce the civilization and bring it to the other Turks in early time. This is also influence from Turkey. Since the Ataturk's reform, they try to reconnect with their Asian history. So Uyghur intelligence, they try to also try to build up a connection with those old Uyghurs. Then they try to they more and more focus on the pre-Islam period. So Chinese think Islam is the problem, is the big problem for them to assimilate those new Uyghurs or change the new Uyghurs. So they all focus on the Islamize the new Uyghurs. And we can see the result. 70 years past, those who are very active on fighting for freedom, fighting for the right of Uyghurs, they want to delete Islam from the concept. And as we know the news, China is also forbidding Uyghur from wearing hijab, growing beard, or pray, or fasting. Then it turns out the result that the Uyghurs also try to throw away Islam, but they still are not assimilated. And there's a large growing Christian community among Uyghurs. This is the result of the this is the result of one result of Uyghur nationalism building. When we come back to the history, those the percentage, the Uyghurs in Tarim Basin, they take 80% of the population, and those people from Kurdistan and Kumul, the percentage is like 20%. But since they have more, they are really the descendants of those old Uyghurs, but they've been assimilated, so they have more stage, and they have more connected to the old Uyghur culture, and they have more contact with Chinese, so they have more developed, I will say so, and most of the diaspora were from this region. First, they those Uyghur originally from this region. Later, they moved to Ulja, and from this region and to Tufan, a lot of them, they had a chance to travel abroad and become refugee, and they stay out of China, and they are the main, I would say, 70% to 8% of the overseas diaspora of Uyghur are from this region. So they more connected. They are more connected to this narrative, although it's not fit the real history, and on the other hand, the Uyghur adopted the Chinese ideology, like Professor Millward just mentioned. They believe Uyghurs were one since a very early time, and once they have the large territory, and they just want to regain it. This is one result of the Uyghur nationalism. And if you cannot get the history to be proved, what would you do? So you tell lie. This is one page from one post from Facebook. This is one of my friends. I told them this is not true. Delete it. It will not help for your struggling. And he refused. And later I found this. This is the original one. Someone changed it and gave it to them. And maybe you notice the flag of the World Uyghur Congress is the same flag of the First Republic of East Turkestan, and also the Second Republic of East Turkestan. But the land is not, the name of the land is not Uyghurstan. It's not Uyghurs country. It is the Turkestan. It's the country of Turks. So they were Kazakhs, Turks, Uzbek, Tatar, whatever, those people who live in this area. But nowadays, a lot of Uyghur activities or kids, they think the flag is Uyghur flag. So, and here, this is another post on Facebook. He was putting something else, and he mentioned the national benefit first. The national benefit here, the word national, not only means the country, but also means the Uyghur nation. So the Uyghurs benefit first. So if they are developed to this period, to this step, what they will do the next? Once those nationalists, they won the struggle, and what will they do to other groups? So since the time is limited, I just want to point out this problem. The Uyghur concept is a given concept. It does not fit for the real history, and not only not Uyghur itself, but foreign countries, Russian, Chinese, Turkey, European countries, and now in this century is America. They try to influence that and somehow manipulate it. And Uyghurs, if they still believe in this nationalism idea, and they have been influenced by Chinese, somehow they adopt the whole ideology from Chinese. So where will they go? And if they keep this idea, will they achieve their goal, or they will bring a disaster? I think this has not been noticed widely, and I think scholars should pay more attention. And this is also somehow related to our topic. So thank you very much. Sorry for my English and so on.
Thank you, Ahmed. Okay, so now we're going to start a Q&A session, so you can stay in case they have some questions for you, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. ¿Preguntas? ¿Cuestiones? ¿Dudas? Venga. Tenemos traductora de inglés, por lo tanto las preguntas se pueden hacer en castellano y se hacen llegar en inglés. ¿Puedo hacer una pregunta también?
Ay, pero no tengo una pregunta de libros.
¿Una? ¿Cualquiera?
Pero cualquiera. I would like to know, like, at what point in maybe both of these professors' studies that you needed to investigate more about terminology and correcting yourself within your own studies to educate other people.
Do you hear the question, Ahmed?
No, not really.
Okay. At what point of your research you saw the necessity to review your language and your terminology and correct yourself in case you use some other terminology you're no longer agree with? No? Right? So we'll let Jim answer and then you can answer the question too, if you want to.
I don't really get it.
Okay. I'll text him. Yeah, no, I'll text him the question. Okay.
And I'll answer a little bit first, maybe, and maybe that'll help clarify for Ahmed too. So the question was, I think, trying to bring together both of our presentations a little bit, and the young lady who asked the question, I'm looking here.
Okay.
The young lady who asked the question, I think, noted correctly that in both of our talks, there's an issue of thinking about categories, thinking about definitions, in particular how nationalism today affects our definitions of different peoples and cultural change. And for me, as an American scholar looking at a part of the world that's far away, it's a different kind of problem than for someone who is a Uyghur himself looking at these sorts of issues, I'm sure. But I guess I've been aware of these things all along, but as I said, they were normal ways, they were conventions of talking about history. And all nationalistic historical narratives do some of the same kinds of things. There's mythology in our own stories about ourselves for all people, right? What's made me think that we really need to attack those mythologies in Chinese historiography now, and in Western historiography about China, why it's so acute right now is what's happening right now, right? Particularly with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but it's acute for any group, really, in China now, non-Chinese groups in particular. There's this homogenizing force. And so I think no longer can a Western scholar with our own vocabulary and our own recycling of these concepts really be complicit in what's happening. So that's when the introspection started for me. And Ahmed, I don't know if you to see what we're talking about yet, but Kiara's been texting you, I guess.
Ahmed, would you answer the question? No, I think you turn your micro off.
Now
Now it's
it's
working.
okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
now it's working.
Yeah, I think yes. The whole terminology, or even I think the discourse, and the narrative. I think we should. Well, I'm not support Uyghur nationalism because in the history, how this people on this in this land, they merged. How they merged into one, like nowadays, was the reason was they were not following the ideology of nationalism. This land is like a path. All these Normans or anyone they want to move to west, they go across here, and some of them they stay, or some of them they just move here, they conquer this land, and later they've been assimilated. That's not really assimilation, because it's really a merge, like compared with other Turkic groups in our neighborhood. The Uyghur language remain a lot of Mongolic words, way too much. The percentage way too much. That means those Mongols who conquered this area, they turn to be one of us nowadays, and that's a sub layer in the language. So the people in this area, they share culture. Well, Islam is very important for them to become one, and they all speak Turkic because they're in this Turkic world. If you want to be civilized, if you want to read, if you want to be educated, you turn to this side. And now they follow this nationalism idea. So we need to change the narrative. Uyghur was not exist in the old time. Well, I mean, as one, you need to accept that. So if you change the narrative, we should change the name. Like Professor Millward mentioned, he made the syndicate. I was going to use Sinosphere, but somehow similar. I never used the word like Han Chinese. So tell me, what is non-Han Chinese? Is there non-Han Chinese? Mm-hmm. So we say Uyghur Chinese, we say Tibetan Chinese, we say Mongolian Chinese. If you don't have the other hand, you don't use this one. This is ridiculous. I consider this is a cheating for the English spoken people. For example, we say Deutsch German or France French. Does that make sense? No. So I think we should use like Chinese for Chinese, and use Cynic for the others who speak Chinese, but they're not considered as Hanzu or pure Huayan, like Chinese Muslim. Those they are Muslims, and they are Chinese China citizen, they speak Chinese, they use Chinese culture, they should be Sunni Muslim. Also, those Chinese, overseas Chinese, they're not, they should not be considered as Chinese because international law, they are holding other passport than PRC passport. So, but this kind of thing, I think, is has not been widely accepted by historians because there's something tradition that will be long time. I would like to change that actually, like your student mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Sí.
I didn't really understand the meaning of the word syndicate.
Okay, so I can actually answer. So Amat, you were challenging the use of the term syndicate, or where I'm using the prefix cynic. And this young lady is asking for what I mean by the syndicate. So I think Amat and I would agree that we're talking about different zones or different realms or different levels, right? Different registers. We might disagree over what word we want to use for which one, and that's fine. We can talk about that. But part of the problem is in English, and I think most Western languages, we have this word Chinese, right? And it's actually a very huge term. It's an old term. It comes from the first dynasty, Qin, right? And that word goes out through Sanskrit and gets into Persian and Arabic and European languages that way, and Latin as sin, right? So that's sort of where it comes from. The problem is that there are multiple ways to translate the Western word Chinese into Chinese in Chinese. There are many, many words that all collapse into this one. I'll just give one example of an interesting contrast. So there's this word Zhongguo, which is the name for China as a country, and has Guo, which means country in there. And that's a shorthand way of referring to the Zhonghua Renmin Gongheguo, the Chinese People's Republic of China. Right? It's also a shorthand way of referring to the Zhonghua Gongheguo, which is the Republic of China, leaving the peoples out. That's the nationalist one, and so on. So it's a political name. If you're a citizen of China, you're a Zhongguoren, right? You have Zhongguo on your passport. All right, and then there's another word for Chinese, which is Zhonghua, and it has this word Hua, which is kind of Chinese in a cultural sense. And so you can be, and when Taiwan in the 1990s and 2000 democratized and stopped being a single-party state that claimed to be the proper government of all China. Instead, they wanted to break away and be Taiwan. They started using this term Huaren, so a person, a Hua person, not a Zhongguoren, not a China country person, but a Huaren. So that was a recognition of this cultural relationship, right? Anyway, so you can make those kinds of distinctions. Ahmed pointed out a problem of if someone who has a Chinese citizenship is not a Han person, are they not Chinese, right? And very often in English, I talk about Chinese and non-Chinese peoples of China, and that's obviously contradictory. That's sort of, so you can say Han and non-Han. Anyway, I'm using so then we make in an attempt to help, but maybe it's just going to make everything even more confusing. Let's throw in this other word, cynic, or this prefix that we have, this Latin prefix that we have, to give us another flavor of Chineseness besides Han, China, and then cynic. And usually it's used in the cultural sense, not the political sense, which I think Ahmed was sort of suggesting here. I'm not sure, but so when we say the Sinosphere, which is a term that's out there, that refers to the greater world, the greater Chinese-speaking world, like Anglosphere, which is English speakers all around the world, right? So people in the Sinosphere are not necessarily Chinese citizens, but you can be Chinese, right? So that's that. Now, when I'm using the word syndicate, that's kind of a particular historical term that actually, I mentioned Islamicate too. That's not a word many people know either. But what we mean is when we talk about the Islamicate, for example, the Islamic world over the long term, from the 7th century with expansion and so on, it was for a very short time one empire, political an empire, and then broke up, but still recognized some kind of broad identity, even if it wasn't politically controlled from, say, Baghdad or Istanbul. There was still a broader Islamic cultural realm, right? So that's the sense that I'm of Islamicate. And I'm saying we have that same kind of broader cultural realm in China, but we don't have a word for it. And so that's why I'm suggesting we use this word. And particularly over time as well. So that we're not saying that all Chinese dynasties are one country or are one state, one political entity. That's what I want to get away from.
¿Hay más? Muy bien.
You said that you like using minority. So what term do you use instead of this?
Okay, good question. So the question was, and I'd like to hear maybe what Amat has to say about this too. The question was, I critique the use of minority peoples for talking about non-Han peoples in Chinese, or in China, in the People's Republic of China. And the particular reason I criticize that is I find it absurd to say that that Tibetans are a minority in Tibet, or even that Uyghurs are a minority in the Uyghur homeland in Xinjiang. Now, numerically, now they actually are a minority, or close to a minority in Xinjiang, depending on who's counting, right? They're certainly a minority in China as a whole. The point is, if it's your own homeland, and thank you for asking this question because I forgot to make the point that I meant to make when I brought this up. If you don't call them minorities, what do you call them? Okay? Just as we've avoided this word colonial when talking about spaces, we've avoided the word indigenous when talking about peoples and indigenous peoples of China. And I think that we should be using that term more. And I'm not saying it's forbidden, you can never use the word minority because, for certain contexts you need to and it's important and so on. But I think to be aware of the implications of that and reintroduce the idea of indigeneity into China, which is really not there at all. Thank you.
Ahmed?
Yes. Yeah, I would like to add something. First, the cynic question. I use an example. This term of Chinese has been taken by the Republic of China, People's Republic of China. So the other China, the Republic of China, which has been known as Taiwan, those people, the majority on this island, they are Chinese. Very few people there, they're really local, they don't speak Chinese. Their ancestor was not from China, and they've been massacred and treated badly in the history. So now they only remain several 100,000. But so I will call these people as Taiwanese. It's fit our way of using of terminology. Those people is from the land. They speak different language. They belong to this land. So I will call them Taiwanese. Like you are in Spain, so I call you Spanish. That's normal. But those citizens of Republic of China. They don't want to be considered as a citizen of People's Republic of China. So they start to call themselves Taiwanese. And that makes a big mess in academic, I mean. So to have one exactly correct translation of the Chinese word 华人 or 华夏 or 中华, we need a word by word translation. Since China extended the meaning of Chinese, they try to put this name on all the citizens of China. So Uyghurs, Mongols, Russian, Korean, who is a Chinese citizen, they consider to be Chinese. That gives us a big mess. So, this is very necessary to have a word for them for that. And the second question of minority, please consider how is your population in Spain on this planet compared with Chinese, who is not minority. That is a joke. And actually, if you go through Chinese history, in their history books, they use other words like aliens, barbarian, or foreign. And in the new communist China, they try to throw those words away. So they made up new thing. They used minority to switch with the words alien, whatever in the history. So this is does not really mean it's a minority. It's just a term. Like I give you another example. Uyghurs will not consider themselves are Chinese because we have a word for Chinese. It's called Dai, like Professor Millward mentioned. It's from those Tibetan originally. We call Chinese Dai. We call the country. We call China as Dai. So when the People's Republic was built, they don't want Uyghurs to think now they are under ruling by Chinese, and they are now one part of China. So they made up a new word. They they adopted the word from Chinese as 中国, and they put some suffixes like ish as 中国路. That means you are the residents of a territory called 中国, but 中国 means nothing in our language. So for us, for the Uyghurs by that time, the people think, okay, this is a new found country. It's very large. It includes different nations. Those Chinese are also one part of it, and the country does not call China anymore. So they were happy. And if you go to the countryside or whatever, you go to those ones who were not had a contact with outside, or they are familiar, or they are not familiar with other languages and the entire history. If you ask, for example, you don't speak their language, you need a translator, or you speak Chinese to them. You ask, are you Chinese? And in their mind, they will think, okay, she's asking whether I am a resident of the territory called 中国. Sure, I am. But what you think is, they think they are Chinese. So we need to clarify this terminology so we will not be cheated. And Chinese are very good at use such things in their entire history. I had some papers on this. There was one quadrilingual inscription made by Qianlong. He even used played this kind of tricks. So that's very important to understand what is the word, the meaning of the word, and what is the meaning behind it. Thank you.
Thank you. ¿Hay alguna consideración más? Pues entonces le damos las gracias. We thank our presentators today and thank you for your presence. ¿Alguien ha dicho algo? No me lo he inventado, ¿no? And okay. Hope to see you soon. Tío, destronada.
I just wanted to say hello.
Hello. Very nice to
Nice to meet you too.
Y
Oh,
nos
no.
vemos
Not
mañana.
that.
This one,
Mañana.
or this one.
Mañana
Sorry,
por la
back to
No, it's okay, I'm just saying goodbye. Nos vemos mañana por la mañana a las 11:30, ¿era? A las 11:30 y mañana vamos a estar en familia total. Voy a estar yo aquí sola a mi ancha. O sea que como una clase, como la clase que no hemos tenido hoy, pero pues la tenemos mañana. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for Skyping in, Ahmed.
Thank you, Ahmed.
And
Nice to meet you.
Hope to see you both soon. Gracias y nos vemos mañana. Thank you, Ahmed. Bye. Bye bye.
Where's Ahmed? Where's he?